we have current professors here, and advertising majors and broadcasters and filmmakers. How, as people steeped in this environment of communication, or do we create this kind of community and to create this kind of large-scale awareness of our time finding biases and our space finding biases, and what kind of balance we should have, and what steps we should take moving forward socially and politically and things of that nature?
Well, that's a big question, and that is the trick. And you know, one answer is we start by understanding. You know, that's why we study it, is to try to understand it. If we can't understand it first, then there's nothing we can do that would be effective, because we're just sort of flailing about or making knee-jerk reactions, either by, you know, there's the two extremes. There's the technophobia, where everything is just rejected out of hand, and technophilia, where everything is we're just in love with everything that comes around. So you have to start thinking about those, you know, about how to balance all the things that are in our environment, and what is the appropriate use, what's not the appropriate use, what are they good for. That was, you know, Neil Postman had. And it was a very simple thing, but he just started to say, you know, to what problem is this a solution? And that was actually a question that just doesn't get asked a lot. You know, what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to accomplish? Where are we going with this? And those are the questions we need to ask. And one of the things is just not to do things. And it's so hard, because we're so geared up to do all that you can. And just the decision to say, no, stop, or I'm going to turn off my cell phone for some time, you know, even though I'm not in an airplane or in class and forced to, you know, I'm just going to take a break, or I'm not going to get this latest technology. And it's tough, because on a larger scale, I mean, I can choose not to have a cell phone, or not to have a television, or not to fly in an airplane. I can't choose to live in a society without these things. And that's the really, really difficult problem for us, is how do we try to get our societies to make a shift. And I'm not sure I have the answer for that one, because the problem ultimately is that if we back off, then some other society is going to push ahead, and so we're constantly driven. Sometimes I think it may only be possible if there is some catastrophe that occurs that forces us into that situation. But I think, I shouldn't say everyone, but I think a lot of people understand today that we can't go on. This will not continue indefinitely, and you know, and that's really the big question mark, is when is the hammer going to fall, and when are we going to be forced to make that adjustment? And we're seeing some of it today with really just an inkling with the financial downturn and some of the crazy weather, but. You know, I mean, that's something we have to think about.
Thank you.
You mentioned that it's important in the educational system to kind of fight against the over-bias of the new technologies towards time. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, maybe some specific strategies at, you know, all levels, maybe specifically like some philosophies about how to present the internet as a tool and an environment to young people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a balance against not against time, but against the prevailing tendencies of the media. And, you know, again, you know, that becomes very difficult, because so much emphasis is placed on getting computers into the schools, getting the kids access to the computers. I'd say number one is shift in focus. You know, I'm not against the technology in schools per se, but number one, teachers. Right. Education is about relationships between human beings, and anyone, if you really want to know, look at what rich people do. Rich people send their kids to private schools where there are very small class sizes. Extremely rich people get a tutor, right? The one-to-one, in terms of educational value, I mean, one-to-one is the best. Obviously, there's something to be gained from social interaction, but class size is first and fundamental. And it's a problem because it's easy to spend money at one moment, buy a bunch of computers, and then you're done with it. It's much harder to hire people and pay a salary continually, whether it's the technicians to maintain the equipment, but more importantly is the teacher. So, I mean, I think it has to start with that, which is the oral and the presence of human beings. And then we do need to put some emphasis on literacy. And when I say literacy, I mean literacy, because it becomes increasingly more difficult. It's simply too many other distractions. And I know that I don't read as much now as I did when I was younger, because there's a lot of good stuff on cable. And I do read, a lot of social media and that sort of stuff, but it's not the same as going deeply into a book. I think each generation, each step along the way, we're losing that habit more and more. We just had an event at my school at Fordham, and Eric McLuhan, the son of Marshall McLuhan, was the keynote speaker at the symposium I organized, and he was mentioning how they were cataloging his father's library, which consisted of about 4,000 books. And and he was someone who read, a book, just a complete book, pretty much every day, and that's very hard to imagine these days. I mean, we just have too many distractions, too many other things going on. So we need to try to rebalance that because that's very important, in terms of what it brings to the table cognitively, and against that, then I think the internet. What's available on there can be, they're very powerful tools. And so, as we use them, we need to be very clear, again, on appropriate uses. What's appropriate, what's not, and how to limit it. And one of the problems with electronics, I saw some study where they said the dynamics of it are very similar to gambling. In the sense that it breeds that kind of addictive, compulsive quality. And I feel it in myself. I get an email and it's like, wow, I know, it doesn't seem like much to you, but when you get older, but you just sort of get into this thing of an email, a comment, a status update, here's something. It's a stimulation. Each bit, each new thing coming across is like a little stimulus that, kind of excites the pleasure centers in some small way. But you get it's very easy to become addicted to that. And I think these are things that we need to work on. And a lot of the antidote is just, again, turn it off and talk to somebody or read a book, but not so easy to do today. That's why it takes work. Okay.
You talked a little bit about religion, not a whole lot. I was sort of curious. You said it was sort of based on a fixed text. And there's sort of an obsession with that to kind of focus on that and protect it and protect the knowledge. But toward the end of the speech, you also say we need to balance with science and religion to achieve that homeostasis. Mm-hmm. So I was just sort of curious what modern religion would look like, or what religion to you should look like in a sort of a stasis environment that you talked about, where it's not obsessed with. Because it seems to me that without a text, most organized religions are text-based, so what does that look like, I guess?
Yeah. Well, when I was talking about the balance, I think that I'm not anti-religion, and I think that I know there are people who are see religion as being completely evil or completely dysfunctional. But I think that religion brings many good things, in terms of promoting ethical, moral conduct and self-control, and in the sense of including that idea of the Sabbath, for example, which. I mean, that's an idea to bring back, I think, in a way. We all could use it, and that really was the idea. You get a day off. And Tiffany Schlein talks about this. She's a filmmaker. She was the founder of the Webby Awards, and she and her family now they observe Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, by turning off their computers and their TVs and just spend time as a family. And it's very hard to do. I mean, the compulsion to check your email, check your status and all that, I mean, it's overwhelming, but I mean, in some ways that's a very interesting and I think a very powerful idea. So I think it brings a lot to the table. When I mentioned it in terms of education, I think something like comparative religion would be a very useful subject to be teaching in schools, but when you ask what does religion look like today, I think we can see it. That when we move past the the text-based era, I think we see it in things like New Age spiritualism, which in some ways goes back to pre-literate or non-literate notions of spirituality, so that there is no longer a fixed text. But we also see it in some approaches to religion, where you get people, many people who don't feel like it's either or. It's like you can be a Christian and a Hindu, you can be a Jew and a Buddhist, you can explore different, I've been told that the Baha'i religion, you can be Baha'i and another religion, that they're not exclusive. So I think there are new approaches to religion that are out there, but we're not quite recognizing them. But I mean, the whole idea of New Age spirituality is that there is no one dogma or there's no one text, but it's whatever people just pick and choose whatever they find interesting. So I think that's actually the kind of religion that's surfacing out of this new media environment, which. What that means for traditional religions is sort of interesting. It's a question of how, as a traditional religion, if you're participating or if you're involved in an organized religion, how do you cope with the new electronic environment? Has been a matter of some concern. I know that among evangelicals, in particular, there's been a lot of concern and interest in the electronic media. But they also ask, what is it doing to our religion to be, to go on to and use these kind of media? Do we lose a sense of God by becoming so focused on the human image, of the preacher through these media? So a lot of interesting questions that are coming up, but I think it does signal new media tend to bring in new religions. So with that's where not long after the Semitic alphabet appears, we get the Israelites, we get Moses and Mount Sinai and Ten Commandments, and Judaism. The early Christian church was very much involved with the parchment codex as a new medium, as opposed to papyrus scrolls. And of course, the printing press gave us the Protestant Reformation. So what now? Well, I think we're seeing it, but we haven't quite put our finger on exactly what it is yet, but we're definitely seeing a change.
Sorry. Well, obviously, whenever any of us are sitting on Facebook or YouTube, we're obviously in the back of our minds thinking, oh, I should be going reading a book right now. But what I wanted to ask was a little more personal. Was there any prominent moment or event in your life where you're just sitting on a computer or during your research that opened you up to looking into time and communication media and just the development of it over time and how we just kind of lost the value of it?
Well, it wouldn't have been when I was sitting at my computer, because I think was interested in these questions before we had personal computers. I can't think of a particular, of an extra special moment where I just said, wow. But I think I've always felt, kind of awareness, or for a long time, an awareness of the peculiarity of living in time. I know Professor Anton likes to talk about this as well. I mean, Ernest Becker, wrote a book called The Denial of Death, and makes the point that human beings are the only form of life that are aware of our own mortality. And that messes us up. It's like, my God. And I can remember that realization. I was in an elevator. I remember the moment. I was in an elevator, and it just sort of hit me, and it was just a weird phrase, but I said, I'm not an angel. That was my, the way I sort of thought about being, mortal, and it scared the shit out of me. What else can I say? And we have to find ways to come to terms with that. And Becker says that's what culture does for us. It gives us a way to live with that knowledge. And you can see so much, and certainly, especially in religion, there's so much there that is about, that literally is the denial of death. It says that death does not really happen in order to make us feel better. But that culture gives us a way to live that's heroic. It makes us feel, in some ways like heroes of our own stories, so that we, that compensates for the complete and utter threat to our self-esteem that the knowledge of our own mortality represents. And actually, the idea of heroes was something that was part of my doctoral research. There's an interconnection there. But I think time. I mean, I guess when you get into scholarship, you start to develop. If you look into just the history of everything, just this awe at the vast history of the world, that goes back, at least recorded history, for millennia. And it's also sobering to think that it wasn't until the 19th century that people really had a handle on that. And that you go back before that, and people didn't know their age, they didn't know when they were born, they didn't keep track of these things. They had vague notions, but I really didn't have the sense of their moment in history. But it's very much for us. We know exactly where we are in this historical narrative, and that's quite extraordinary, I think.
Thank you so much for your lecture. And I have one more question. Living in the era of advanced technologies, what do you find the major professional challenges for specialists in communication in a professional setting? Thank you.
Well, the challenges for communication specialists are just unbelievable, right? Well, I just mentioned history, right? So our colleagues who study history, you know, I mean, relatively speaking, they got it easy because history hasn't changed. And, you know, but for us, it's constantly changing. You know, we're just constantly trying to keep up, and you can go crazy trying to keep up. So, I mean, I think communication specialists have a very difficult job in trying to just simply understand the media environment because of all the innovation that's happening. I can't think of a bigger challenge than that.
First off, thank you for coming in tonight. It's been a great lecture. With social media, how do you believe, like updates, the documentation of that, do you think that's light or heavy media? Because I was kind of intrigued by that.
Oh, well, I mean, it's certainly light. Well, I mean, you know, it's an interesting question. I mean, we see it perform the function of light media because these are messages that are transmitted. You know, I go on Twitter, I tweet, and it goes out. You know, and you know, there are people in all different countries getting it. I mean, you know, that instantaneously. So that's, you know, that's speed of light. But there's a funny kind of added quality to it where with the archiving of these messages, and I've come across websites that are not Twitter that were archiving my messages, you know, I mean, not just me, but I mean, I don't know if it was everybody, but I mean, you know, I don't know why they you know, but it just seemed, even the ones I deleted, they still had there, which I'm not too happy about because some of them were mistakes, you know. But you know, and what the hell's going on here, right? And you know, and that's that notion of total recall, and it's a very strange kind of environment, and of course this is the problem for, you know, the generation growing up with Facebook is that, you know, or you know, you in your youth you post a picture of yourself that you know, upon reflection you probably shouldn't have put out there. And it's out there, and maybe you can delete it, but maybe it's still out there in some versions. Maybe other people downloaded it, and maybe they put it on other websites. You know, people with children are sometimes concerned about this because apparently the people who do child pornography sometimes take pictures, you know, just ordinary pictures of children and use them. And distribute them. So there's, you know, I mean, it's just a very strange environment in that sense. And yet, on the other part of it, I know that librarians are concerned about digital archives because there is the possibility as well. For one thing, there's format change. I got on my office computer, I got a new version of Word. We get new computers every 3 years, right? So it has the latest version of Word for Macintosh. And I suddenly discovered that version of Word wouldn't open some of my older Word files. It just wouldn't open it. Now, I mean, there's a workaround. I've got an older version of Word or on other computers, and you know, I started to make these transfers. But these are kind of concerns, and no doubt there are programs out there that could do it. But these are the kind of concerns that are voiced, that there are format changes, there are media changes. Anyone play any floppy disks? You know, load any floppy disks lately? I just threw a whole bunch of them out. I was cleaning my office. I don't, you know, maybe there was something on one of them that that I don't have anywhere else. But I just got to the point where I can't be bothered anymore. So there is a sense of volatility, and then there's that third issue, almost Orwellian, almost like 1984, where it seems to introduce the possibility of making changes to the historical record that could possibly be untraceable. So it's a different mix of things. as all new media present a different mix of things. That's what I was saying, is that it seems to be that the internet and the web and the whole new media environment is not simply space biased the way we saw radio and television as space biased. It's bringing back a time bias as well, but in a way that is not. Just because you get a balance doesn't mean it's a good balance, and that's the question as well. It's nice to it's probably improvement to get a balance, but is this the kind of balance that we want? That's where I'm not sure, and maybe but there still is the possibility of trying to provide some guidance so that we get the kind of balance that we want. And then on the other side is that if we go too far in the time bias, that's where we see, and I think that does go along with the rise of fundamentalism and some of these other kinds of things that we see happening. It's just, it fits in with that. So, so there are concerns, yeah. Oh, sure, one more. I'm fine.
One more question?
Hello.
Make it a good one. Yeah.
I don't even know if this is useful to even speculate about or anything like that, but anyways. Would it be possible to unbind? Could we plan some kind of destruction of all recorded history, and if it were possible to wipe everyone's collective memory? And would it even be possible to wholesale reject symbolic language, although I have a difficult time imagining anything living without language, which I guess is inherently symbolic. But would there be any advantage to us if we were able to do that? Would there be any advantage to that?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and actually a couple of questions there. Would there be any advantage? I do think that we suffer from history. I think our inability to forget, because that's where you get these long-standing grievances. So many of our conflicts today, these are conflicts that have been perpetuated over centuries. And that is a problem. That again is why we need that flexibility. The great thing about oral tradition was the ability to just say this is no longer relevant, not consciously, it just was the part of the process to just slow off, just the stuff we don't need. And we can't do that anymore. And that has some advantages, to retain things, but it also has its disadvantages. If we wipe the slate clean, I think all those science fiction stories in the long ago, we'd still tell stories, and they would turn into myths, and we'd probably start the cycle all over again. So, I think we need to move forward. Not, I don't think we can go backwards. And we may have to. That may be the case, but I think the ideal is to find a way to move forward. The idea of going without symbolic communication is an interesting one. There was, in the early days of virtual reality, some of the virtual reality pioneers like Jerome Lanier talked about sort of post-symbolic communication, right? Because if you can just reproduce the world, through a computer program, then you no longer need symbols in a sense. But why do we have symbols? Because they're so incredibly efficient. We don't have to experience everything. We can boil it down into a statement or a generalization. I think without it, we'd be screwed. Basically, I don't see how well we'd survive for very long without that capacity. Or we certainly would return to being a kind of minor species, trying to run some antelope down in the, obviously we evolved out of not having symbolic communication, and in some individuals we do find we find a reduced capacity or a lack of that. And I know Corey was reading the different things I was looking into. I mean, autism is one of them, where with individuals with autism, some have no symbolic communication, some have a limited form of that. And they don't, while they can certainly contribute to human society, they don't seem to have the capacity to survive on their own. So it's hard to imagine them, being able to do that if we were to go back to kind of hunter-gatherer situation, if you were to have a tribe of such individuals. So I don't think that's going to work, really. But I wouldn't want it to. I think words are great. I like words.
Well, on that note,
Here are 2 good words. Thank you.